the annual June Fox Lecture is one of Lesley's longest running lecture series, having begun in 1997. And that really honors the former Dean and Professor Emeriti June Fox, as Amy said, whose work advancing equity and opportunity through education is so well known. It's just one of the ways that her legacy continues to inspire our current GSOE faculty and students and alums. And I'm so glad that this is resuming virtually this spring with the 4 Lesley faculty that Amy mentioned, who are themselves people who are really advancing equity and literacy instruction, STEAM and multilingual learning and the special needs education. So I thank you, Grace and Nettrice and Laura and Stephanie for being today's panelists and moderator, and for sharing your research and your insight. In the context of the racial justice movement that has continued to gain momentum and support over the past year, our determination at Lesley to address inequity across all of our systems is growing, and indeed increasing access and equity and education at all levels is so urgent, and we feel it more and more every day. It's always been central to our mission, but this year I think we've taken stock of our own DEIJ policies and procedures and invested the human capital to deepen our understanding of how we can improve our climate, as well as position us as a thought leader in this work, behind the work of so many of you who have done so much to advance it. I think training our community on eliminating racial and other implicit bias has been and will continue to be a first priority. We know that we have a lot of work to do to become a more inclusive learning community, and we're committed to doing it. So I am again delighted that this panel is here, that you are going to have the opportunity to hear all of the wonderful work that they're doing. And I hope that June Fox will be proud of what this is all doing at Lesley today.
My name is Meg Burns, and I'm faculty in GSOE. And as a member of the June Fox Committee, I'm honored to be able to introduce our panelists and moderator for this evening's discussion, Inquiry in Education Equity. I'm going to, in the interest of time, skip reading the full bios and just give you a quick intro to each of the panelists, and you can read their full bios on the flyer for the event and on Lesley's webpage. So our first speaker will be Dr. Nettrice Gaskins, who is the Assistant Director of the STEAM Learning Lab at Lesley, followed by Dr. Grace Enriquez, who teaches courses in the language and literacy programs here. And finally, we'll end with Dr. Laura Schall-Leckrone, who teaches in our graduate TESOL and bilingual ed programs. So our moderator is Dr. Stephanie Spadorsha, and she is the chair of the Teaching and Learning Department. So we'll begin with Dr. Gaskins, pass it right on over to Dr. Enriquez, followed by Dr. Schall-Leckrone, and at the conclusion of the 3 presentations, Dr. Spadorsha will moderate a brief discussion with the panelists. At that time, I think you should be able to use the Q&A feature to ask questions, and if time allows, Dr. Spadorsha will try to integrate some of those into the conversation. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Gaskins.
Good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen. Here to talk to you today about some of my work. So the title of this presentation is Techno-Vernacular Creativity and Innovation, Culturally Relevant, Making Inside and Outside of the Classroom. And so I'll talk about what techno-vernacular means in a second. So research, some of the research that's been done, like the National Science Foundation, the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics, and then other research has been done to address gender gaps in STEAM and making, but fewer studies center the practices and products from African-American, Latina, and Latino and Indigenous communities. The reason why I put up this NSF NCSES chart on the right is because it shows in the last few years kind of where these African-American, Latino, and Indigenous groups sit in terms of science and engineering, and then non-S&E fields, which includes the humanities and art and education. So you can see for engineering, for example, there is, in terms of African-American, it's 3.9% it's very, it's actually the one area that's the smallest. And this gives you a sense that there's not enough representation in engineering from some of these groups that I just mentioned. And it gives you a picture of what is represented. And so this is fairly recent and something that NSF has been really good at doing over the few years, is keeping track of what's been happening. And so many students from underrepresented groups have lived experiences that include uses of STEAM concepts and applications that are different from formal methods that were taught at school. One example that I use is Grandmaster Flash, who was a pioneer in hip hop culture and somebody who has been seen as a kind of a scientist of sorts. And there's a picture of him in the first two circles. DJ Flash used a scientific methodology to extend time and percussively rearrange beats. He was a self-taught engineer who customized the audio crossfader to control more than one audio source and keep people dancing, which is called the Get Down, which is also a series on Netflix, which features his work. The crossfader allowed DJs to manipulate sounds and to create new music that practitioners could perform, such as what's called a cipher. In that third circle, you can see an example of that. The cipher is an important element of hip hop culture. It provides a structure for sharing knowledge and information readily understood only by those actively engaged in it. The cipher is also a place for people to demonstrate and practice their skills, as well as a place to enact self-definition and theorize one's existence in the presence of community. Ciphers represent kinship building practices that are derived from personal or group conceptions of identity, and kinship suggests that the sharing of the characteristics, origins, so this idea of shared learning in the process of working together is something that's a very important part of this activity. So dancers, rappers, and other creative communities of practice use the cipher as a set of group protocols and interactions that include symbols, heroes, rituals, and values from different cultural traditions. So it's something that you find not just in African-American communities, but also in other non-Western communities around the world. So although a number of scholars and educators within the maker movement have argued the need for more culturally relevant approaches to making, few have developed this work with young people at a higher level of technical depth and creativity. Often missing from these discussions is how maker practices affect African-American, Latino, and Indigenous groups, as well as girls in and outside of school. So these modalities you see here on the screen expand STEAM and making and maker education, connecting technical literacy, equity, and culture through techno-vernacular creativity, a term that refers to innovations produced by ethnic groups that are often overlooked. So the three that I'm referring to is remixing, reappropriation, and improvisation. Reappropriation is the cultural process by which marginalized or underrepresented ethnic groups reclaim artifacts from dominant culture and the environment. You can see a picture here of Kelvin Doe. In his teens, he was known as DJ Focus and he's from Sierra Leone. And he used trash basically to put together a radio station and make other innovations for his community and also support his DJing. And so he's someone we could look to as an example of reappropriation. Remixing is amplified by widespread access to computer technology, whereby existing works are rearranged, combined, or remixed into a new work, a song, a section of artwork, a block of code, a book, a video, or a lesson plan. In this picture, these are students from middle school in Lithonia, Georgia, using a culturally situated design tool based on Afrofuturism, and they're learning how to do coding and math at the same time by remixing the blocks in the program. And then improvisation refers to the spontaneous and inventive use of materials and content that elicits the active engagement or participation of underrepresented ethnic communities. So in this picture, we have a student from Boston Arts Academy who's a dancer who for a chemistry class, and her and two other girls in her class created a dance floor that was interactive and is connected to a laptop and a microcontroller. So as she's moving on the circuit, she's also, you can hear music being played in the space, and they are kind of forming a cipher, a circle around her. So I came up for the book that I'm going to mention in a second, I came up with a toolkit that takes some of those modalities and breaks them down even further into these areas such as modulating, where you're breaking down a system into smaller parts that can be independently created, modified, replaced, or exchanged between different systems. Translating, transforming dominant ideas, combining, layering, and merging different forms, materials, and sources to make new things, encoding, using alteration or adaptation to redeploy the material and symbolic power of cultural artifacts, patterning, performing operations, practicing algebraic thinking, and using geometric properties such as rotation and reflection, repeating, making things that perform in cyclical or looping patterns, such as call and response participation, which is known throughout the African diaspora. And so these are all part of the toolkit. And I added this kind of last minute because this is something that I've been looking at, we've been talking about in Lesley's team, is looking at computer science and how College Board has had some success in terms of reaching out to African-American, Latino, and girls in terms of students. And this particular quote, in terms of the success of the AP Computer Science Principles course, is you can see it in yellow there, the creative component and the collaborative component are huge in drawing students, especially for underrepresented groups. They're getting to see that computer science is for them. And then on the right is a picture of me, and that is in high school. And that's the first time I ever used a computer to, in this case, make art. I was not interested in computers until it was to make art. And the inset photo is me doing some printmaking. So I have some connection to all of that. And then my book that's coming out in August is seen on the left. And also some of that work, the modalities and things are being put into the instructables that I'm developing with Lesley STEAM. And you can see the link there on the Lesley STEAM Labs site with the STAR Initiative and Biogen supported projects. And so there's also a link to the book, which is with the MIT Press. And it's really, this is a short version of that, but hopefully this is enough for folks to get some idea about what my work's been about. And I'm done.
Thank you so much. We're going to hand it right over to Dr. Enriquez.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. And let's hope that I can get this to work so that you don't see my presenter notes. Okay, so hello, everyone. I'm honored to be here with my colleagues, Dr. Gaskins and Dr. Schall-Leckrone, and to share a slice of my current inquiry work. I've titled this presentation, Humanizing Relationships, Practices, and Research, using photo-elicitation narratives to humanize Black men and boys. This is also the title of a manuscript about this work that's currently under review. And I want to acknowledge my co-researcher, Dr. Tisha Lewis Ellison, who collaborated with me on this project and was just so excited when I told her that I'd be sharing this with all of you. So I want to begin by flashing some names on the screen as a way of framing the larger context for this inquiry project. And I want to share a story. While at a conference in 2015, Tisha, my colleague and collaborator, was presenting a poster, and she was approached by a white female who just had sheer astonishment on her face and in her body language. And this woman was responding to Tisha's poster images of Black fathers engaging in non-digital literacy practices with their children. The woman admitted that she never thought this kind of work could be done about Black fathers and men. She admitted she was just completely influenced by the negative portrayals of Black men in the media and in society generally. And she commented how shocked she was to see them in a different light. This moment stayed with Tisha for a long time, and she knew immediately that she felt really defensive about what this woman said. But at the same time, what this woman said validated the need for her to continue doing research that spotlighted the humanity of Black men. And Tisha and I had known each other for about 5 or 6 years at this point. So at a later conference, we met up with another colleague and friend of ours who pointed out that our research has a lot in common. So we need to put our heads together and do something about it. And so this PEI inquiry project was born. To explain the project, I refer to this question. What does it mean to conduct research for justice with youth and communities who are marginalized by systems of inequality based on race, ethnicity, and other categories of difference? When we began collaborating, we found ourselves returning to this question over and over again. To us, this question reinforces how much of the educational knowledge around Black men and boys remains to be seen as humanizing. So when we started this inquiry, we wanted to spotlight the goodness, refute the negative stereotypes, and present a more complex and humanized portrayal of Black men and boys. And we also wanted to see if there was a way we could help illuminate the literacy practices of Black men and boys beyond the stereotypes that exist in the field of education. So we turned to the concept of humanizing research and relationships. And there are 3 quotes I want to share about this. The first is from Paulo Freire. Dehumanization, which marks not only those whose humanity has been stolen, but also those who have stolen it, is a distortion of the vocation of becoming more fully human. And so humanization is not only ethically necessary, but it also increases the validity of the truths we gain through research. Listening and storying with and not on or about youth participants allows researchers to learn from, collaborate with, and center their narratives. We also turned then to photo elicitation interviews, or PEI, because we knew that photographs have power. Images have power. In the opening example that I gave of Tisha's poster, photographs were what caused the woman to connect more with the fathers and their stories that Tisha was presenting about. And it humanized their existence in ways that she might not have grasped otherwise. Unlike just sharing photos and looking at them, PEI uses them as a springboard for responses that are not usually observable from regular verbal interviews. And this process also allows the participant to become the teacher and works to level the power dynamics between the researcher and the participant and work towards decolonizing the research process and findings. We set out to investigate the question, how can PEI work to humanize the literacy practices of Black men and boys? Since Tisha's in Georgia and I'm here in Massachusetts, we collaborated on a comparative case study. Tisha used PEI to explore the literacy practices of Billy, a 39-year-old Black man, and I used PEI to explore the literacy practices of David, a 13-year-old Black boy. And if you're interested in our specific data collection and analysis methods, email me, I'd be happy to share. So why have we decided to inquire about Black men and boys when we're women? We decided that in giving voice to marginalized communities, we could potentially run the risk of approaching research as this gift of empowerment. Like, I am now bestowing you the opportunity to have voice, and then you can share your voice, but we are going to interpret it. And we didn't want to do that. So in humanizing research, researchers ought not to take from the voices, but to learn from them. We do identify, this is Tisha and me at that exact conference where this idea was born, and I'm realizing now that I'm wearing the same outfit as I am in that picture. But Tisha and I identify as researchers of color, but we still found ourselves examining and claiming our racial subjectivities. And so, we thought about how throughout our careers, we've worked to capture and embrace the hidden and marginalized stories with the Black and Brown communities for decades. These are also our fathers, our sons, our brothers, our cousins, our nephews. These are their stories. But humanizing research scholars also held us accountable to the ways that we build relationships and conduct research with our participants. Since Tisha can't be here to co-present with me, I'm going to quickly share that her PEI with Billy humanized his literacy practices by illuminating how central they were to his relationships and daily life with his family. So here you can see them engaging in a family craft project. They were reading directions, taking turns at being the teacher and the learner, and working collaboratively using traditional literacy skills of reading, speaking, and listening. I'm going to focus on David. David was 13 years old, He had recently experienced some family upheaval. He was now living with his father, who hadn't been an active part of his life for some time, but whom he deeply admired and he just always spoke positively about. He was identified as a struggling reader in schools. And he described school as boring. He wanted a more diverse selection of courses. He loved cameras, computers, studio equipment. He was on the basketball team and he participated in this program for disadvantaged youth and families. And here's why PEI holds the potential to do more to humanize David as a reader than just interviewing, having reading interviews with him or giving him a reading survey, these tools and these methods that teachers typically do. So imagine being a 13-year-old who's been told your entire life that you struggle with reading across all your grades. You've heard this repeatedly. And what if you see that perpetuated in the newspaper, on TV, about other kids who look like you? And what if you hear it in the school hallways when teachers and administrators talk to one another? Then imagine being asked by your teacher to fill out a reading survey or a reading inventory to talk about what you think about reading and what your reading identity is. I'd known David for about 7 months at this point. I sat in his classroom for twice a week during his literacy block. And I thought that instead of asking him to speak or write about reading, it might be more fruitful, it might be more interesting to have him show me. So I gave him a camera. And maybe I should have been a little bit more explicit about what I wanted, but here's just a sample of what he brought back to me. He had taken 23 photographs, half were taken at home, 11 were candids of his friends and classmates at school. But as I looked across these photographs, I started to see two patterns, and that they warranted more attention regarding the potential of PEI for humanizing who David was. The first set of photographs were these items on top of his dresser. And he took several of them from different angles, spotlighting different objects in the photos. And when I asked him about it, he said that these were his awards and stuff that he's proud of. And he repeated over and over again how proud he was of them. So notice the certificates, notice the basketball trophy. And when I asked him more specifically about this one here, he expounded a bit more and he said he was bored for a second, he was just walking around, and then he started reading. And he said, I was reading hard. I must have got 100 that day, meaning his participation grade. The second pattern I saw was that he had taken photos of people who mean the most to him, his basketball teammates and his father. And when I asked him to tell me more about the photo, this one here, of his father and him, he just smiled really big and he just said, "we in it." And that's all he wanted to say. And so when I thought about it, I asked him more, tell me more about your father then. And David said he referees basketball clinics and he'll take me to them. And it seemed initially that he just wanted to take pictures because he enjoys taking photographs and that he loves his dad and he's proud of these. But as we continued talking, the more he opened up about his relationship with his father and with reading, working to humanize David as a reader. And so what do I mean by that? Oh, sorry, that was his dad. What do I mean by that? So here's an exchange I had with David. David, well, my father told me that when I was born, he thought I wouldn't be able to read. He thought I wouldn't. Really? Yeah. But you're reading all these great books in school. Right, he sees me now and it's different. How do you feel about that? Good. And so when I took that exchange and I took the photographs and I took the conversations we had, the PEI conversations from the photographs, I realized that PEI helped to draw the connection between the many photographs of his reading and basketball awards, the photographs of his father and his basketball teammates, and his reading identity in school. Remember that David's teachers and the coaches there kept referring to him as a struggling reader. But not only was David using the camera to highlight his achievements, he also seemed to be declaring that he can read. He just wasn't declaring it to the school, he was declaring it to his father, whose approval mattered more to him than anything. So if all we ever did was view David through this identity, his perceived identity as a struggling reader and all the assumptions that entails for a Black boy, we would be severely limiting what we and ultimately what he believes about himself as a reader. Putting the camera in his hands and humanizing him beyond the classroom walls revealed how fiercely proud he was of what he has already achieved in reading, even if it doesn't yet meet the external standards of teachers, administrators, etc., for distance from his everyday life. And I left wondering, who are we to continue to say that he's another Black boy who struggles with reading? Just really, really quickly to wrap up, researchers, teachers can use PEI to humanize and decolonize our relationship with our students by getting them to tell their own stories and experiences around the information that they collect. And PEI can be used to challenge the negative portrayals about Black men in educational research and practice. But for me personally, as a literacy educator and a literacy scholar, PEI helped me to refute the notion of a reading identity, especially the myopic perception that Black boys aren't readers. And if they are, they're either, that rare example of the kid who just loves to read, or more stereotypically, a struggling reader. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll pass it over to Dr. Schall-Leckrone.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's such an honor to follow Dr. Gaskins and Dr. Enriquez. And I want to thank the June Fox Committee for the opportunity to share my work, and I'll just share my screen. Can everybody see that okay? So my talk is entitled Linguistic Ecology, Languages in Action in a Multilingual Elementary School. And this was a project I was engaged in last year during my sabbatical. And so after many years in education, first as a student and then as a teacher, my friends outside of education were teasing me because I went back to kindergarten. And what you can see here is the first day of school for kindergarten for these bilingual children and their teacher, who I'll call Mrs. Samia. And so in terms of this research, there's insufficient research that portrays the complex communicative resources of bilingual teachers and children in economically disadvantaged communities and looks at their language skills as assets and resources in literacy development. And for that reason, the purpose of this research was to provide a rich, multi-layered representation of languages in use in a multilingual elementary school in a gateway community, a world of many worlds centered on the project of teaching and learning through languages. And so I look at languages in schooling as a matter of social justice. Educational linguistics is interested specifically in the role of language in teaching and learning. And I draw from the work of Halliday, who says that language is the essential condition of knowing, the process by which experience becomes knowledge. And Mary Schleppergrill adds to that to say that in the absence of an explicit focus on language, students from certain social class backgrounds continue to be privileged, and others who may not speak academic English at the dinner table, disadvantaged, perpetuating inequalities that exist and persist in schools. And so this work is based on an experience I was fortunate to have last year as linguist in residence during my sabbatical in this K-6 multilingual school. It's a place where I had a long-term relationship with the children, teachers, and principal. The principal had been a former student in a class on educational linguistics that I teach a few years ago. She then invited me to come to the school to teach the same class, but I wasn't interested in parachuting in as a white woman, as someone who presumably had answers to questions they hadn't asked. Instead, I wanted to be a participant, an observer, and engage in the work of the school. I saw it was a caring place with deep, loving relationships, a principal who lived in the community and was bilingual herself and had been the leader of the school for 14 years. And so I invited her to co-teach the class with me. And so that happened in the spring of 2019. And then I was fortunate to be able to stay on as presumably linguist in residence as an artist in residence might be, drawing an attention to language as a platform for literacy development. And that year they were also implementing a new dual immersion kindergarten classroom where all the children spoke Spanish and were learning in Spanish and English. And so as the year started, I was on site in the kindergarten classroom with the teacher, who I'll call Mrs. Samia, a pseudonym, and working with the young children tying shoes as a participant observer, also supporting language and literacy reading with kids and collecting data. The ideas that I draw upon in the research I conducted and the writing I've done since then has to do with the ideas that were first presented by the New London Group, and that 21st century literacies, plural, are multilingual, multicultural, and multimodal. And I'd be happy to share more about this conceptual framework, which guides the research I did if anybody's interested. And I'll reference a couple of publications. But again, the idea is that young children naturally use multiple modalities to communicate. If you've been in an early childhood classroom, you'll see that. And that we as educators need to learn from how we can use those modalities and languages from the community as assets and resources in literacy development. So when you enter the school, which I'll call Arborway School, a pseudonym too, you see this banner: "The future of the world is in this school." The multilingual elementary school served approximately 600 learners, kindergarten students who were as young as 4, which seemed quite young last summer when the school year began, and as old as 11. Recognizing the importance of language, on the district website, the school was, I thought, ironically classified as 96% minority and 100% free lunch. There were 3 meals served each day at the school. Approximately 80%, the vast majority of children spoke another home language, were bilingual individuals, and many of them were multilingual. The vast majority were Spanish speakers. Of the children in the kindergarten classroom, all came from Spanish-speaking Latinx homes, as did the teacher, who came from Puerto Rico as an adult. In this research, I was really interested in the question, how are languages used in different spaces in the school, both non-instructional and classroom spaces, and among individuals, to introduce students to schooling and to support language and literacy development. I collected a lot of data over the course of last year until the school shut down, like a lot of places, in March. And this included surveys, observations, field notes. I had a very capable student who was my videographer, who helped with videotaping after they became accustomed to my presence in the kindergarten classroom. I collected student and teacher work as well. And I was really interested in the ways in which children were using different forms of communication to engage in relationships, learning of languages and literacy skills. And so I drew upon multimodal discourse analysis, which is involved with isolating, examining, and explaining an aspect of lived experience to understand how those engaged in it are using multiple semiotic resources to carry out regular social practices like teaching and learning. So what? One of the book chapters I've since written about this experience in the kindergarten classroom looks at scaffolding and how the bilingual teacher used what I'm calling multimodal ensembles to introduce young learners to school and scaffold language and literacy development. And so the idea is represented of the multimodal scaffolding in this visual, and that oral languages, plural, written languages, objects, movement and gestures, drawing and pictures, all can be used in concert to support learning of how to do school in both the positive and sometimes unfortunate ways, as well as literacy development. In a second publication, I learned from and drew from a really ingenious observation that a student, I'll call Yesenia, made as the class was engaged in a storytelling episode. And so the title of this book chapter is called La Tortuga Está Tiptoeing. And what she was doing was observing what was happening as her teacher read aloud from the iconic scene of the tortoise and the hare, and two children were acting it out. And so this chapter is really examining how the children in the classroom use multiple communication modes to interpret, retell familiar stories such as that one, and also create original compositions. One child did an extraordinary series of pictures about global warming that I write about and talk about in this particular book chapter. And so the idea is that if children are given the opportunity to flexibly use their languages, plural, in this case it was Spanish and English, embodied learning, movement, gestures, material objects, writing, and drawing, this can mediate their engagement in the genre of storytelling. So I noticed that some of my former students were in this session, and they'll know that one of my favorite questions is, so what? I ask it all the time about teaching and learning, so what? And so in regard to this research, I believe that linguistic ethnography has important contributions to make to educational policy, teacher education, and teaching practice. That in documenting the pluralist discourses of multilingual communities and valuing home languages and multilingualism in schools, that we really can inform a policy context that has unfortunately trended toward English only in this country. In addition, that asset-based accounts of multilingual learners making practices, when we don't pathologize the language used by children in disadvantaged communities, but we look at it as assets and resources, we can bridge the knowledge gap that exists and unfortunately persists between a predominantly white monolingual US teaching force and a majority BIPOC student population and increasingly multilingual student population as well. And finally, that the language and literacy pedagogies that we engage in schools should address and build on multilingual learners' language-based strengths and needs. And so I'll just conclude with a snapshot quick of my very small font, I apologize, references, because I'm really building on the work of a lot of others as I discuss all of this with you. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. So Dr. Spidorsha, I think we're scheduled to go till 5:30, but maybe I'll take the liberty of saying that we could take another 10 minutes to have a brief conversation, as long as that's okay with everyone else. And I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you very much. It's my privilege to listen to three colleagues here at Lesley. As always, that's why I miss so much being on campus where we hear and see each other. But it was such a privilege to hear the three of you. First, I want to also make sure, Marianne, are we going to open up the Q&A so we can see if people have any questions? If people want to put a question in the Q&A, or we're going to do the chat or the Q&A?
The Q&A is open, so people can put questions right in there.
Okay, great. So I'll make sure to moderate that. I also want to make sure to point out, I know Nettrice, Dr. Gaskins, you put in some links to some of your work there in the chat earlier on. So people want to take a look at those links before you leave the session. So I don't people's chats are all wow, all the things that we're learning here. So I have one question as we wait to see if anything comes in through the chat, is what was so compelling to me is the three of you, the work that the three of you do really reveal how important it is to look at what students are doing beyond the classroom, beyond the set curriculum. So Nettrice, your work, for example, showed us how hip hop culture and the technology of it related to STEAM, photography, and home interpretations of literacy outside of the classroom. Grace, and the expression you just used, Laura, the assets and resources that are available by being multilingual by young children. How could we, one of you want to answer this, how could we bridge this in a more effective way to engage and create a more inclusive classroom environment that's more socially just, and as many of you mentioned, decolonize our curriculum and engage our learners, our young learners of all ages? I don't know if one of our panelists, want to take on that question.
So I'll just say that I actually went back and looked even before the PhD work I did and realized that I had been doing the cipher in my teaching all along, even before I even thought about it. So looking at photographs, looking at students and how they're working, always in a circle or in some sort of formation. It doesn't have to be a circle, but in a cluster where they're all participating. There's no hierarchy. There's no expert. There's everyone learning together. And I think that possibly my experience in hip hop maybe had something to do with that, just maybe as an artist, as someone who came from that, I was really looking at that, but also I have a very asset-based approach. Every student that comes into the classroom or into a learning space has assets, the knowledge that they bring that can be used to help unlock some door for them into something that's unfamiliar. And once students know they can do that, it kind of changes the space a little bit, even if it's in a formal setting. So the chemistry class, the teacher sent the girls to the lab so that they could do a chemistry project around dance and a conductive paint. And it became a performance that they were actually able to perform as like a show and tell to the other people in the school at some point. But it was always this open door type of situation where they remembered something they had seen in the lab, and they thought, okay, we could explore chemistry and dance and do a performance and use and so it was still a cipher. It was still the idea of it, but it was also using their knowledge, the girls in their dancing, hip hop, the music, all that kind of stuff. But also in any culture where students are coming from, they have STEAM, so they bring it to the classroom.
Thank you for that example.
I want to reiterate something that Nettrice said at the very beginning. It's the asset-based approach, I think, that matters the most for me. I think too much of education focuses on deficits and what kids can't do and what they need to do to meet a certain standard or to meet a certain curriculum requirement. But if we start with what they can do rather than what they can't do, and if we also take a position of humility, I feel that is something that I don't think is really emphasized a lot in teacher preparation, that there's all this pressure, especially in our era of accountability, teacher accountability, that teachers have to show what they know. But what if we start from the position that we don't know? And our students are our teachers, and they know a lot of stuff, and they're trying to show us stuff. If we just stop or pause, I know we can't stop because we still have to, meet certain job requirements. But if we just pause and ask, what can they teach me that I don't already know about them? And how can I use that to rethink what I think I know? I think it's a shifting mindset. It's a hard mindset. But that's my first response to that question.
Yeah, how to put away that pressure, right, of meeting the curriculum, the timeline of the curriculum, but allowing these important outside of school-based literacies and worlds and cultures and experiences, and seize those assets and help make the connection stronger and make relationships with our students. Laura, were you going to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, really just to build on what Grace said, and I wish I could remember in this moment, I think it's Cindy Ballinger who said that we really need to learn from puzzling moments, because children are making sense even when we don't necessarily know what that is. But in the mad dash sometimes to get to the finish line, and because of pressures on teachers, sometimes we don't pause. And maybe just two other pieces which I think connect to this, in which, especially now, I think all teaching and learning is relational. And so really recognizing that as the number one factor to facilitate learning. And then second, for me, as somebody really steeped in educational linguistics, making language visible, especially for those individuals who may only speak one language. Language is like the air we breathe. Sometimes we don't notice it, we don't see its power. And so I think it's really important that language and languages become more visible to us.
Thank you. So some of your responses straddle, because our audience here, some of us are teachers, some of us are teacher educators, some of us have been teachers for a long time. We have some brand new teachers that I'm so proud of today that won awards, and others, right, that are new to the field. What's a manageable way for a teacher in the classroom to engage in this kind of inquiry? Like, if I try this, if I have them bring in something from their home, try and help understand these assets that they bring. What's a manageable way in your, as teachers, teacher educators, that you think teachers could bring this into their classrooms?
So that's why I mentioned the toolkit. So the toolkit actually has, beyond what was in the slideshow, but in the book, examples of how you would use those modalities in a kind of teaching and learning situation. And they're all coming from anecdotes that either I know about or that I've actually been a part of as a teacher, or, you know, that kind of thing, and co-designing curriculum. But the whole idea is that this is not something that we're going to do something in modalities or and remixing. We don't have to say that. It's just the activity is incorporating those practices into the work. And so that's the important part, is that you're keeping that in mind and being very intentional about it when you're designing the course, so that it's part of what you're doing in the classroom or in another learning setting. And so that's important. The intentionality of it, and also the willingness to give some space to students to be able to explore that.
Thank you. Grace or Laura, either one of you?
So one of the research projects that I'm beginning, hopefully it'll really pick up once schools are open again fully. I'm looking at children's multimodal responses to reading. And I think that there are so many ways that kids can show us that they are engaging and making meaning of the things we give them to read. But the vast majority of the time, we check to see if they really understand it through writing and speaking. And that's it. And that doesn't really show us that kids are fully engaged, or it doesn't show us what meaning they're making out of the things that they're reading. So my recommendation is to offer just many different opportunities for students to respond, to show what they know through all sorts of different modalities. So perhaps through dance, as Nettrice showed us, that was amazing, by the way, or perhaps through visual art. Perhaps, why does it always have to be, a literary essay? Why can't it be a poem? And there are just so many ways for kids to express what they know and to teach us what they know, and yet we just continue to limit it. So that's just what I think might be really helpful.
Good point. Thank you, Grace. Laura?
And I'm new to looking at languages through multiple modalities. So I did reach out to Grace when I started this line of research for some suggestions about what to read, and other folks, because I wasn't anticipating that. But in kindergarten, I noticed, in really watching how young children were communicating, how essential it was to think about multimodal responses to literacy opportunities. And in particular, because the teacher in this classroom was skilled at drawing, she used drawing, and the children took up drawing as a really important way to engage with school genres. And it was such a loving classroom that, and I had one myself, the little boys who were really unable to sit still had other roles in the classroom. I think we have this idea that all kids might need to do the same thing. And I've always believed that instead we should really look at what kids are drawn to. And so I mentioned I had a videographer. He was a child who was about a head taller than the other kids, and greeted everybody who entered the room with a stuffed animal, and was able to set up my tripod much more quickly than anybody else, and engaged in literacy through the laptop I brought, and had some of his own documents, and was really accomplished with the video camera. But had he been required to sit still and do what the others were doing, it would have really been kind of a miserable experience for him. He wasn't. And so I think we need to start to, and it's hard when you're a new teacher, become a little more accomplished at recognizing that not everybody needs to do everything in the same way through assignments and offer different opportunities. So I do want to check out Nettrice's book and what Grace has mentioned. And I would suggest there was a visual I showed in one of the chapters I mentioned, and I talk about in the chapter using multiple modalities as a strategy and tool to plan units and lessons. And so that you're thinking through what are all of the different ways a child might show what she or he or they are learning in the process.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Meg.
Thank you very much. So this is going to conclude our program for this evening, and thank you all so much for staying an extra few minutes so we could engage in more of an open-ended discussion. Before we leave, I just want to congratulate our awardees one more time, Catherine DeCara, Anna Azar, and Andrew Kreiser. And I also want to thank our panelists and our moderator, as well as Dean Rutstein-Riley, President Steinmayer, and Bill Dandridge for joining us and supporting this wonderful annual event.